Our next speaker is Dr. Kelly Smith, who is an associate professor of philosophy and biological sciences at Clemson University. His research interests include the concept of genetic disease, the relationship between religious faith and scientific reasoning, the ethical implications of biotechnology, and all things astrobiology. He is the founding president of the highly interdisciplinary group Society for Social and Conceptual Issues in Astrobiology. Let's welcome our speaker.
Hello, everybody. Okay, you can see that fine. I did want to take just a second to point out that I am the president of SOCIA. If you don't know about it yet, it's a very interdisciplinary group. It basically examines all the broader questions that might come up when people are doing space exploration or astrobiology. If you're interested, let me know. I'll put you on the listserv. Now, let me warn you, this is a weird talk. Now, I'm used to giving weird talks. I'm a philosopher who shows up at like science conferences, and I'm talking about the nature of life or something like that. And I know that people in the audience think it's weird, but that's different because they're wrong. This particular talk, if someone came up to me afterwards and said, that's a weird talk, I would have to say, yeah, you're right. That was a very strange talk. It all started a couple of years ago when I wrote a paper, and for the first time in my life, I wrote a paper that took on a life of its own, so that when the paper was done, I'm like, this is not what I meant to produce. It's got the R word in it. Very strange. I almost didn't publish it. But I've come over the 4 or 5 years since then to realize I think it's an interesting idea. So I'm just going to lay this out for you. A little prefatory CYA is always a good idea to get in here. I will say a couple of things. First of all, I am trained as a scientist, at least to the extent that you consider biologists to be scientists. That might be a hard sell with this particular group, but I'm trained as a biologist. And, until very recently, I was a pretty standard atheist. So if you'd told me 5 years ago that I'd be giving a talk about religion, I would have thought that I was going to be, yelling at religious people or something like that. This is not something I ever really thought I would do. I'm not entirely, one way of thinking about what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out a very generic hypothesis about a possible sort of compromise between science and religion. I'm not sure I believe it. Some of the empirical bases I think are suggestive, but they're not really fully there yet. I do think it deserves consideration, and if you're not convinced, you can yell at me. Hopefully I'll have 10 minutes at the end that you can yell at me. Otherwise, you can wait for the book, but I think I'm probably going to do a Darwin on that and think about this for 20 years and produce it only when someone's about to scoop me. So you may have a bit of a wait. And anytime in this presentation where you see scare quotes, those are advised scare quotes. I'm like, well, I could have 4 slides talking about what I mean here, but I'm just going to put it in scare quotes, and then you can yell at me if you want to. Okay, so I'm going to start by caricaturing the two sides of the continuum between science and religion. And since it's a science group, I'm going to start with you guys first. So, caricature number 1, the atheist science. This person believes that science is really the only means of attaining truth, and that anybody who believes something without adequate scientific evidence is just wrong-headed, right? Weak-willed, thinking wishfully, something like that. And they always say something like, with the proper education, humanity will eventually see this basic truth and be much better for it. You know people like that if you aren't someone like that, and there's a good chance that there are people like that in the audience right now. A lot of people think that's a relatively unproblematic position, but I'm going to problematize it for you right now. Scientists don't, indeed they can't really believe this. Now, that's the kind of claim that makes people think that philosophers are arrogant, but it's true, right? So it's okay. We're committed to certain basic propositions when we're doing science that are themselves not, in principle, scientifically defensible. That's just a fact, right? In particular, we have to believe to do science that the universe is a cosmos. It's a system that can be understood by human reason. Otherwise, what are we doing, right? And we also have to believe that the empirical methods of science are the only, or at least the best means to revealing truths about the universe. Now, believing these things has turned out to be fairly successful, but that is an extraordinarily weak defense of them, right? It doesn't mean that they're correct. It might just mean that so far we've gotten lucky, right? Anybody who has a superstitious belief about their lucky socks can make the exact same argument about the powers of their socks. Well, every time I've won these socks, we won the game, so the inductive argument goes through. Science is inductive by nature. It basically means we observe a bunch of stuff over and over again, we formulate an explanation that is consistent with that pattern, and then we believe that, if you will, we invest faith in the truth of that explanation, right? But Hume, and before him, Al-Ghazali, pointed out, a basic sort of logical problem with this way of thinking. You cannot, if science is inductive, you cannot inductively establish the truth of future observations because you don't have access to future observations. All you can say is, in the past, these patterns have borne out, and I believe they will continue to do so. But if someone says, well, how do you know that gravity won't become, the polarity of gravity will switch in the next 5 seconds, it will be thrown out into space? How do you know that's not going to happen? You can't really answer that question except to say, it hasn't so far, which, I'm with you. I don't think it's likely to happen, but I can't really defend that in a strong way. So there's a real problem with science if you have a strong enough view about what truth is and about science being the only method to find it. It's the best method we've ever found to discover truths about the natural world, true, but it's not really clear that it provides truth with a capital T or that it's the only method of finding truths about the natural world, right? And really that's not controversial. If you don't like that, then you're either engaging in wishful thinking or you just haven't thought about the problem carefully enough, because that is true, all right? Okay, now we move on to what's much more fun. We're going to caricature the other side, the man of unshakable faith. This person believes, let's say, in some traditional monotheism, just to make it a lot simpler, divine being violates the rules of nature whenever he feels like it. They tend to believe that reason is fine to the extent that it supports their faith, but should be thrown out immediately whenever it's in conflict with an essential element of their faith. And they say, similar to the scientists, with the proper education, humanity will eventually see this basic truth and be much better for it. So at least there's that thing that both sides share, that if you could just educate people to the right point of view, everything will be much better. Okay. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the problems with the sort of religious view because they're relatively obvious, but quickly, traditional religions were developed by illiterate peasants with basically no knowledge of what we would call science. It's an exceptionally poor guide in general to understanding the physical world, and although you might argue that you have to start somewhere and make some unsupported assumptions, starting with the assumption of a divine being with inscrutable motives is one hell of a starting assumption to have to swallow. So yes, in some sense it's like a cosmos, but the cosmos is sort of designed to be as minimalist as you can get, and saying there's this inscrutable being, it's really hard to argue that that's the same kind of move in some sense, right? So faith is, one way of thinking about it, it's not really a provision of an answer specifically, it's more of a mindset. It's how you orient yourself, how you think about a certain set of facts, right? The philosophers might call this a blick, but I won't get into that. And it's true that leaps of faith are unavoidable, but that fact is not an adequate defense of any particular leap of faith. So sometimes religious people will say, well, science is just a religion too, and this is what they're talking about. You have to make some leaps. And they're right about that, but that doesn't mean that that leap of faith and the other leaps of faith are all in the same category. But generally speaking, a leap of faith is, I think, okay, provided that it is consistent with the best evidence we have. And in order to make sure that continues to be true, you have to commit yourself to reevaluate that claim on a regular basis, so that when new evidence comes along, you check to see if it's still consistent with the leap of faith you made last year, and if it's not, you need to reassess. Okay, so the question is not whether we make leaps of faith, it's which ones we make under what circumstances, right? And I want to ask, is it possible to construct a system which captures some of the advantages of religious belief without some of the weird metaphysical stuff, right? This is a hypothesis that Bertrand Russell, the famous philosopher, made a while back. And he said something like, wouldn't it be great if we had the good stuff from religion but none of the weird stuff? And that always sort of stuck with me. And I think it might be possible to do that, maybe. So let's try. Religious faith, however you view that, does provide a sense of meaning in our lives, in particular a purpose to what we're doing. It sort of sets that in a larger framework so we can tell a story about how what we're doing matters, right? And even if you don't feel the need for that, it's undeniable that that's a deep-seated need that most human beings have experienced for most of our history, and I would argue inductively, it probably means it's going to go on for the next 1,000 years or so. It's not going to go away just because you don't like it. And of course, it also provides an ethical guide for how we should live our lives. Some of my atheist friends would say, if I could push a button to make religion go away, I would. And even when I was an atheist, I'd be like, are you sure? Like, I'm not sure that's a very good idea. The world might become a much worse place very quickly. If you did that, you might regret that one. But religions do provide an ethical framework. Now let's talk about complexity. And notice the complexities in scare quotes. I'm just going to point that out. I'm not going to talk about that. It's possible to view the universe as a system which produces increasing complexity over time, right? Not only does it become more complex, but it creates new kinds of systems that produce complexity at an ever-increasing rate. So, you can tell sort of a just so story. Atoms come together to produce molecules. Molecules produce chemical systems. Chemical systems produce life. Life produces intelligence. Intelligence produces culture and science. And we're off to the races, right? And at each of these levels, you're getting more and more complexity produced at a faster rate than before. It took billions of years to get the first life, but it took, 100 years for, people to go from crossbows to gunpowder weapons. So it's possible to view the universe as a system for producing complexity. Now, when you say for producing complexity, you've introduced a purpose to the universe. So it doesn't sound like it's much of a linguistic change, but it is actually kind of an important linguistic change. There's no scientific argument that that's true, but neither is there a scientific argument that that's false. And to my mind, that's where a leap of faith is legitimate as long as you do it in the right kind of way. This is consistent with science. It's not necessarily established by science. And there is some scientific support for this possibility in a broad kind of way. Most of you are familiar with the Anthropic Principle and the discussions around that. In biology, there's a really interesting hypothesis that's come forward recently that basically says that in a population that's evolving, the leading edge of that population will tend to become more complex over time, even in the absence of natural selection. That it's just a dynamic of an evolving system that the leading edge will inherently become more complex, which is really interesting. It sort of suggests a default setting that pushes populations towards complexity. Now, if we're going to have a naturalistic faith, there's some things we have to agree on, right? We can choose to believe the universe exists in order to produce complexity, right, in a perfectly natural fashion. We can believe that our purpose as beings in this universe is to understand and contribute to this complexity in some sense, right? But we have to allow that whatever specifics we believe about that religion have to be set up in such a way that they're constantly subject to review in light of further evidence. Otherwise, we get dogma, and you don't want dogma. Advantages, well, this does provide a vague but nevertheless overarching explanation of why we're here and what we're supposed to be doing, right? We're here because we're on team complexity. Go team complexity, right? Our job is to sort of help team complexity do complex things. That's basically what we're here for. And you can, in fact, get an ethical system out of this. This gets really complicated, so I'm not going to talk about this very much, but I'll just say this much. People tend to value certain kinds of things in ethics in a way that's never really very well explained. Like we value rarity. Rare things are considered to have more value than common things. Well, if you take this view that what the universe is about is producing complexity, rarity and the kind of diversity it represents is the kind of thing you should value. So it provides a framework for sort of establishing the value of things that we already grant ethical value to, just in a mysterious kind of way. Okay, so what you can't do, no believing in supernatural beings, right? Things get really weird really quickly when you do that. You can't believe in the infallibility of any particular aspect of this religion. So again, it has to be subject to constant revision. And you can't believe that there's a specific complexity goal. So Dina said something about how evolution aims towards a progress, and then she said, biologists don't believe that. Yeah, that makes us get very upset. So you can't think that the universe is trying to produce humans. It's trying to produce additional complexity. Humans are one of presumably an infinite number of ways in which that might happen. You can't go, yes, aren't we amazing because the universe coughed us up after 12 billion years. That's a bad way to go. All right, that's all I have to say. Now you can ask me questions and tell me why I'm wrong. Sure.
Okay, so I'm a big fan of Tipler and Barrow. Okay, you know who they are. Okay, after wading through the Anthropic Cosmological Principle, which is a tome, indeed, complexity and life, particularly intelligent life, is an extreme rarity and probably has not replicated itself. Now, how do we know, right? That's what SETI and all those things are about. But what was really intriguing is one of the researchers, Stephen Carter, says, okay, so the real problem with carbon-based life forms is the stability is such that it probably won't last for more than a couple tens of thousands of years. So putting those two pieces together, they had this ultimate conundrum. And I just was wondering if you'd thought through that.
Well, I have thought through that. I don't think I have definitive answers to those questions, nor do I think there's simpler, right? So, but I'll say, I mean, with the simplest,
no, I think he does.
I don't think so.
Well, okay, so so he's undergone a conversion of late, you know.
Here's a quick response to your question. Doesn't it strike you as, shall we say, convenient that we, a complex life form that's intelligent, manage to convince ourselves that intelligence is unbelievably rare? Right? Isn't that exactly the kind of thing that humans always do? Like, we always find ways to go, wow, are we ever special? Right? I'm old enough that when I was in school, they taught us things like, well, tool use, that's our thing, right? And then it's like, well, okay, not so much with the tool use, but, you know, cooperative hunting, that's our thing. Well, okay, not so much with the cooperative. Like, it's, so, I mean, that's not a definitive argument, but it's enough, I think, to make you pause and go, wait a minute. We have come to the conclusion that someone would have predicted a priori conceited humans would come to. Now, there's an evolutionary argument I can get into that's much more complicated, but I won't do that here.
Well, no, I was satisfied that they had not created their mathematics out of nothing, at least. Okay.
So you're aware of the existence of the Vatican Academy of Sciences?
Really? Is that a thing? Yes, I know about them.
If you attend their meetings, there's a group of real scientists who advise the Pope and the Vatican, and they actually, do things like discuss evolutionary biology and map it out in front of the Pope when he's actually heavily involved, and he doesn't argue the points of the Bible.
That's right.
Okay, but this is no problem for you giving your talk?
Oh, no. In fact, I'd say that Catholic theologians are good examples in some ways of what I have in mind. Like, when I first started talking to Catholic theologians, my basic reaction was, oh, like what you mean by God or a divine universe is so abstract that it doesn't really have, we're talking about theologians, not Catholics, right? It doesn't really have the kind of problems that are associated with Protestant beliefs I'm more familiar with. If everybody believed religion like that, the world would probably be a better place. But I'm not sure the average person can maintain that kind of subtle metaphysical abstraction like the highly trained theologians can. But I like Catholic theologians. They're fine.
I'm a string theorist by background. So I found it interesting what's been developing within science in the last, say, 5 years or so, and that is the debate of, or the claims by some that cosmology has actually becoming a religion in the sense of string theorists. And we ourselves, in arguing for the evidence of a multiverse, are saying the Anthropic Principle is out. It's not that humans are special anymore. It's just that there are enough universes that it's inevitable that we exist in some. But the idea that we're actually promoting things like that is causing many experimentalists in particular to say we've gone beyond science, that we are no longer presenting theories or hypotheses that are proper falsifiable. And there have been articles coming out literally claiming that cosmology has moved towards religion or theology's side.
Okay, well, let's say a couple of things about that. First of all, it's not so much that you're going beyond the evidence for the first time, it's that you're realizing that you've been going beyond the evidence. Right? I mean, like, Popper sounds great, and scientists love Popper. But if you corner any philosopher of science and you go, hey, what about Popper? They'll go, yeah, it doesn't work, man. Like you can do the logic, and it does not work. but it's a story scientists just love to tell about themselves. So, the reason there's a job for people like me is that you could do philosophy of X and fill in X with any scientific discipline. And there's that weird edge, in physics, maybe it's cosmology, but I can piss off biologists by going, you guys all study life, right? And they're like, yeah. And I go, what the hell is that? And then you get an argument going and they don't really know what they're talking about. It's like, that's weird. You don't know what it is that you study. So, I think there's that. The other thing I would say is you can get into a huge debate about what religion is. And I'm not even qualified to do that. Like, using the word makes me very uncomfortable. I wish I had a better word. Someone suggested philosophy, but as a philosopher, I don't like the idea that philosophy is sort of like, well, like whatever. So I need a better word. But I would say, I think if you really want to be doing a religion and you want it to be somewhat analogous to what other people call religions, you probably at least need some potential for an ethical system. And I'm not aware of cosmologists formulating an ethical system. Okay, so you still got a hurdle to clear.
Yeah, there was an article, though, in Physics Today a couple of years ago where they actually accused us of forming a theology.
Oh, well, yeah, it's a swear word in science, right? You guys are being religious or going beyond the evidence. Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to suggest that there's a broader field of inquiry, of which this is only one piece. And it has to do with the domain that you kind of palmed the card on very early in the presentation when you said, science is a means of finding out the truth about the physical world. Mm-hmm. And the issue is the physical world does not constitute the entire domain of the field of inquiry. This is if you want to pick a less controversial example, this is well understood in the field of economics. Anytime you're talking about a field, some piece of which includes human behavior, you have this problem that science cannot be, that the science that you can apply to the field is no longer prescriptive and predictive in nature. It is at best descriptive, and general principles can be obtained because you have these free-willed agents running around who quickly become aware of the things that you've said about them mm-hmm. and change their behavior, in some cases just despite you. Right. So this problem of the ascendancy of science, because of its demonstrated success in teaching us the truth about the physical world, leading us to believe that those same principles teach us the truth about all other domains of inquiry, goes much broader than the field of religion or philosophy or ethics or whatever you want to call it.
Sure.
It's, whether you believe that humans have free will or not, we sure act like we do.
Right.
And that poses problems whenever you have any part of any phenomenon or behavior where free-willed humans are part of the equation.
Well, and that's pretty much all behaviors that we're describing, right? So the first thing I'd say is I'm not one to draw hard and fast boundaries. I'm a philosopher that does biology and space stuff. Like, I'm fine with fuzzy boundaries, right? But on the other hand, I think, if you think that everything's a science in some sense, I don't know that there's a lot of value you can mine from talking about the fact that some kinds of scientific enterprises involve humans and therefore they're fundamentally different or something like that. I mean, one thing I could say just to cause this room to sort of think is observer effects, right? So it's not like physics is clean and can avoid the idea that stuff doesn't change when you're talking about it, because it does. We don't know how to explain it, but it does seem to do that. So, I think anything humans describe is sullied by human interpretation, and that just has to be part of the way you think about it. So then the question is, well, what kinds of interpretation do you want to have, and how is that going to cause problems you don't need to cause, and how is it going to be neutral, and et cetera?
What you're discussing here is an evolution from what used to be called pantheism, that divinity was immanent in the universe, something the tales of Miletus, Spinoza, and later Einstein truly believed. And it's evolved into science now as panpsychism, because as the philosophers realize, nobody can determine whether the multiverse or the Anthropic Principle is correct. This can't be done observationally. If anybody does it, I will recommend them to Stockholm. Come to me, and maybe you're ready for your prize. And to me, it's fascinating that you've been saying this, because I and a few other people, probably an increasing number of people, have been searching for evidence of panpsychism in the universe on levels from the, or should we say, self-organization, maybe in a group like this that would be better, meaning the same thing, of course, from the molecular level all the way up to the level of the galaxies. And the results have been fascinating.
Well, again, I'm a philosopher, so I don't like to say anything can be ruled out. I think pantheism is fine. I'm perfectly happy with people describing this in some sense as a pantheistic view. Panpsychism is a different thing. Now you're talking about like some sort of mental attributes aside, residing in physical objects. And to me, although it's certainly possible, that starts to smack of weird metaphysics. Like, I want some hardcore evidence that this projector has anything like mental states. Maybe it does, but I don't see any. And I'm perfectly happy to go, this projector is part of a universe which is, okay, you're fine. But it's thinking or it has intents, I'm not.
Sometimes when you're trying to get it to connect to another computer, you'd be absolutely convinced that it has got diabolical intentions.
And that's another example of how easily misled we are by our primitive monkey brains. We think that things are out to get us when they don't cooperate. But the projectors, well, maybe they don't like you. Maybe that's the problem. They don't like you. So.
All right. So first part of this that I was curious, where did you pull the word for in this structure that you've created? Where did you decide that the universe as a whole has a purpose at all, and that you pulled the word for out of, it's for the purpose of increasing complexity? I'm curious as to where you pulled that and why you put it there and how that is something that you can rely on as part of this structure. The other question I have is when you were saying that, trying to figure out the exact right way to phrase this, that we assume, the correlation and causation when we're trying to figure out what has caused something. But I'm also a biologist, and I've studied world religions. Naturally, I ended up as an atheist. But if you're going to say that, in science we have to make that leap of faith, no, we have to actually demonstrate causality. So it's not just saying, well, we saw this and we saw that, happen subsequently. So if we see it enough times, we've established causation. No, you've established correlation. We actually have to be able to demonstrate the connectivity and the causation in order for it to actually count.
Okay, so let me give you a quick answer to both your questions. In my defense, I did point out when I said for that this was an important move and you needed to be skeptical of me when I did that, right? So at least I admitted that. And it doesn't come from anywhere in the sense that I have a good empirical argument that there's a for there. That's the point at which I think you can choose to adopt a basically teleological attitude about this fact about the universe. You can view it as a brute fact and go, what can you do? Or you can go, well, I'm going to choose to interpret that in this kind of way. And as long as that's not inconsistent with science, I'm groovy, right? Particularly if it also has other pragmatic advantages, like it helps you talk about ethics and things like that. As far as the other one's concerned, correlation and causation, philosophers, well, let's just put it this way. Have you ever established a cause? Oh, really? I tell you what, I will send you to Stockholm if you give me definitive evidence of a cause. Because what I'll bet you right now is what you have is an amazingly consistent correlation. And at some point you go, well, good enough for me. But the philosopher in the back of the room is going to be like, well, dude, like you didn't see causal force being transferred. You don't have empirical evidence of the causal essence. What you have is, well, after the 10,000th time, I get tired and I call it a cause. Okay, but that's not the same thing, right? So, it's all a matter of degree.